to Ask About Fly Fishing Internet Radio, your source for learning more about fly fishing in cold water, warm water, and salt water. Hello, I'm Roger Maves, your host for tonight's show. On this broadcast, we'll be featuring Mac Brown, and he'll be answering your most important questions on specialty casting, getting your fly to the fish. This show will be 90 minutes in length, and we're broadcasting live over the Internet. If you'd like to ask Mac a question, just go to our homepage at askaboutflyfishing.com and use the Q&A text box to send us your question. We'll receive your question immediately, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible on the show tonight. And while you are there, make sure you sign up to receive our announcements so that you don't miss out on any of our future broadcasts. Just fill in your name and email address on the form on our homepage, and we'll keep you informed. This broadcast is being recorded and will be available for playback on our website within 24 hours after the show ends. So if you have to leave early, you can return to our website at your convenience and listen to the broadcast at any time. The content of this broadcast is copyrighted and is the property of the Knowledge Group, Inc., doing business as Ask About Fly Fishing. Recordings or transcriptions of this program cannot be distributed or sold in any form. When we return, we'll be talking with Mac Brown about specialty casting, getting your fly to the fish. The Federation of Fly Fishers needs your support. Its conservation projects at both the national and club level are addressing critical issues of importance to fly fishers. It is involved in the Mangrove Recovery Initiative in Florida, in the Trout of the Desert Southwest Initiative to help the recovery of rare native trout, the Endangered Fisheries Initiative, and is helping to prevent the introduction of harmful aquatic species to new waters with their Clean Angling Pledge. The Federation won a National Conservation Award for its efforts. To continue this great work on behalf of all fly fishers, the Federation needs to increase its membership. It needs more concerned anglers willing to join in to support of such projects, and by doing so give something back to the sport that has given so much to each of us. Join the Federation of Fly Fishers today and help support their fine work. For more information, go to the Federation website at www.fedflyfishers.org. That's fedflyfishers.org. Well, before we introduce Mac, we'd like to let you know about the great gifts we have to give away tonight. And for our drawings tonight, we'll be giving away a one-year membership to the Federation of Fly Fishers and a one-year subscription to Fly Fusion magazine. So you have two chances to win tonight in a drawing. Now, if you haven't registered yet for the drawing, you can do so now. Just go to our homepage, which is at askaboutflyfishing.com, and look for the link under Mac's section that says, click here to register for our drawing. Click on that link and fill out the form, and we'll announce the winners at the end of the show. We'll also be giving away, thanks to Mac, a copy of his book, Casting Angles. And what a nice gift to give away tonight to go along with our show. And here's how you're going to win. You must be the first person to answer the question we ask at the end of the show. And the question is going to be something that Mac and I talk about during the show. And you must listen closely and then submit your answer along with your name and location in the text box on our homepage. So listen closely and use your best typing skills at the end of the show, and maybe you'll win Mac's book. Well, tonight, our guest is Mac Brown. Mac Brown is the author of Casting Angles, which is a fly casting handbook for those on the journey of understanding the cast. The ACA, the FFF, and others have endorsed this text as a reference for instructors as well. Mac is a casting instructor through the FFF, and that's the Federation of Fly Fishers. He resides in Bryson City, North Carolina, and his work has appeared in Fly Rod and Reel, Fly Fisherman, Angling Report, ESPN, Outdoor Life, Field and Stream, Fly Fishing America TV, and many others. He was an Angler of the Year for Field and Stream and has been a pro staff member of Ross Reel's Scientific Anglers, Richardson Chess Box, G. Loomis, Sims, and many others since the early 90s. Mac started the fly fishing programs for Western Carolina University in the mid-1990s. He has specialized in casting instruction, schools, demos, lectures, destination trips, and clinics. He has fished around the globe many times in pursuit of sport fish. The 40 years of knowledge and skill Mac brings to the sport of fly fishing have helped thousands of beginners and advanced anglers alike become more proficient in the art of fly casting. His enthusiasm and passion for the sport is contagious for all levels. Well, Mac, welcome to Ask About Fly Fishing Internet Radio.
Thanks, Roger. It's good to be here.
Well, good to have you. Are you out of the snow out there in North Carolina yet?
Well, it's still coming down tonight.
Really?
Yeah, we've had a lot of cold this winter.
I guess, for North Carolina. Kind of unusual, right?
It is.
Well, we've got a lot of things to talk about tonight. A lot of great questions came in from our audience, as usual, and they've thrown in some hard ones for you here, I see, too. But I'm confident you've got the answers here, Max. So we're going to try to, a lot of the questions are dealing specifically with different types of casts, and that's one of Mac's specialties is getting that fly to the fish, as we said in the title of our show, because many times getting that cast under the brush or around a rock or across the current is a difficult thing, and so Mac's going to do his best to help us out tonight and guide us in that respect. Now, but first of all, we did have some interest in, what it takes to become certified by the Federation of Fly Fishers as a casting instructor. And so I thought Tim Bear in Central Illinois asked that question, Max. So could you help Tim out and kind of give him a rundown on what that takes if you wanted to pursue it?
Sure. Tim, I would say one of the best places to start would be the FFF website, and there's a lot of information and literature for the CI program and the MCI program, as well as the double-handed certificate. And you can pull a lot of that off the internet, and it has the task and a lot of the oral questions that are going to be asked of you for those tests. Then the other thing I would recommend is there's some really good forums at Gordy Hill, Guy Manning in California, Gordy's down in Florida, and Al Kreis in Texas have done a really great job with a continuing education forum for candidates as well as existing instructors. And I think that's a really powerful tool for sharing a lot of this information. And if you live close to an instructor that's, it's already in the CI program or MCI, you can also, they have what we call a mentoring program, and I think that's actually a really good program as well, to where they can kind of guide you along during that pursuit.
And Mac, would you clarify those acronyms you used? What was it? CI and MCI?
Certified instructor, the master casting instructor, and the double-handed instruction. That's for the double-handed rods.
Okay, and what's the difference between the certified and master?
That's a good question. They just have a little bit more requirements, I think, for the master casting instruction platform. They have, the test itself is set up quite differently, probably a little higher technical difficulty with some of that.
Okay.
And I think it's definitely much more in-depth as far as the orals. There's a whole lot of questions, Roger, on the oral part of that test that becomes much more in-depth.
Okay, so they have to go through to be certified. They have to take a written, which is your oral test?
Right. For the certified, it's actually a written test.
A written. And then you have a practical, which is actually casting, right?
Right.
Okay.
And then in the masters, it's all pretty much orals with the casting in addition to that. And I'm
assuming you have to become a CI before you become a MCI, right?
Right.
Two separate tests.
That's right.
Okay. And can that be taken from any other certified, or does it have to be taken from a MCI to become certified?
Oh, yeah. There'll be two master instructors for the CI test.
Okay.
And then the master casting instructor and a board of governor for that test.
Okay. And does that have to be taken up at their facility, or can it be taken?
No, we have them at a lot of the shows, like the fly fishing show. There's several of those that have taken place at the big show in Denver, Chuck Ferminsky's show, the fly fishing show. Oftentimes they're set up at those. There's several regional conclaves throughout the country for the Federation, and they're also given at those.
Okay. Now I'm going to turn this around a bit and ask you, as a consumer now, and I'm out looking for a fly fishing instructor, how should I qualify them? And I'm going to kind of qualify my question here, because the first time that, and this is nothing just in general against, fly fishing instructors, but you kind of think that somebody certified might be qualified to teach, and yet I found the first time that I engaged one to have a lesson that they really didn't know how to teach. They were a great caster, but they didn't know how to teach. And the second one I had was just incredible and really helped me out and got me straightened out on a lot of things. So what questions should you ask a potential instructor to kind of find out how good they are and whether they're going to suit your needs.
Right. A lot of it's like all the books and media, in regards to casting, it's more of a mindset, I think, in that the ideologies a lot with instructors, there's not a lot of emphasis on diagnostics thus far in the Federation. I mean, we're hopefully working more in that direction, but just because someone's a great caster, is what I'm trying to say, doesn't make them a great teacher. There's lots of great casters out there. Some people have a gift at diagnostics that is just spot on the first try, and they can sit there just verbally with one sentence after the next and sit there and improve somebody just verbally from comments. Of course, some people are much better at diagnostics, I think, than others, and it's not back to the same level of, they may be the same, casting-wise, but yet one can pick out problem areas much quicker, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Right, and that's exactly what happened with me. Is the second instructor, the first one was more, well, here's how you do it, and he just, he'd throw a 60-foot cast out there, and I'd try it, throw it 30,
Exactly.
and then the next person that I had as an instructor, who actually came by, word-of-mouth referral, he would say, well, turn your wrist just a little bit and do this, and then, the diagnostic part you were just talking about. And he just really quickly fixed me, like a chiropractor,
Right.
Let's turn this and switch this, and all of a sudden everything's starting to work, So.
Exactly. I think a lot of that, too, back to your original question, is the journey overall that people are on, and I've always looked at it that way from when I was a young kid, is the journey of talking about casting means so many different things, and I think that's another way to answer your question, is it means so many different things to even instructors, and it's, as well as the general casting population. In other words, what they deem to be important may change a great deal the more and more they do it, and they get appreciation, is what I'm trying to say, for more and more in-depth types of things that can control different casts that we use basically in fishing scenarios. And I think that's a big part of it too, is the general populace. A good example, we watched the Olympics the other night up in Vancouver, and they had a little commercial, and how many commercials do we see on television today? And they show this beautiful lake with the mountains all around Vancouver, and a fly caster standing out just thrashing the water. The line's not straightening back, the water spray's coming off every which way, and I'm just like, I can't believe that, to be honest, as a fly casting instructor, that's one of the big problems throughout America, to be honest, is we put this stuff on TV. Now, what do you think the average Joe at home sees when he sees that? He thinks, hey, that's fly casting. But that was just pathetic what they showed for this commercial the other day, and I mean, it really just appalls me that we put that kind of thing on a TV commercial.
Yeah. Well, can I safely say then a good route to finding a good instructor would be ask around, get word of mouth, and get some referrals?
Yeah, I think referrals and that go a long way. When you get referrals from like the type of people you have on your show, of saying, so-and-so, and, up in Maine, that's who you need to see. I mean, that's kind of how it works. I think referrals and word of mouth is a very good way.
Rather than just picking someone off the FFF roster of certified instructors. That's the gamble that you take if you do that, I think.
Yeah, referral, word of mouth is always going to be so much more valuable, I think.
Well, good. Well, let's kind of start at the beginning first, because I know as an instructor of almost anything, sometimes if you jump to the more advanced stuff, sometimes reverts back to basics again, right?
Right.
If you don't have the basics down, then you can't do the fancy stuff. And Kent in LaGrange, Georgia, asks basically that question: what are the true essentials in making an effective fly cast? No fancy stuff, just, getting the basics down pat.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's a little bit of a trick question, too, because it depends who would, if I wanted to answer those same essentials and I wanted to talk, say as Lefty or talk as the FFF 5 essentials, depends who we want to answer it from, and so it really sets me up for a trick, kind of. So I'll answer it with what I would say, what I believe, and I would say force, timing, tension is going to equal the layout that I want to achieve. And if I look at it as saying what's going to get the job done, if we talk about the force of the cast, we'll kind of elaborate on these 4 things here in just a second. And timing being the next ingredient, that will yield, a certain tension throughout the line, depending on what I'm trying to do, and that basically is going to end up being your layout. And I think it's back to what you asked kind of with the first one, in the fact that what is a perfect cast? Tim Rajeff and I had this discussion 20 years ago when a student asked. It was funny. It happened to him about the same time it happened to me in a class with about 20. It was a corporate group, and one of the guys was like, "Oh, what is the perfect cast?" And I thought, and I go, that's one of the best questions a student's ever asked, because is there such a thing, is what I would say back to you, like our Kent, even in Georgia. I mean, what are we looking for? What are you trying to do? And it's such an ambiguous, question when we don't even have any water or any trees or any obstacles to say what is the perfect cast just in our mind. It becomes pretty, a lot of openings is what I'm trying to say.
Sure, because a perfect cast under a bush is one thing, and a perfect cast over a current is another, and a perfect cast on flat still water is another, right?
Well, exactly, and that's the thing. Even with that was one thing that was, highly confusing, to be honest, to me. With the Federation, basically the essentials we teach is power, pause, slack, straight, and arc. Those are the 5 ingredients we talk about. And if you think about the way those are all spelled out, like for the CI program, and it's good, it's very good if we're talking about a straight line cast, like with parallel loops and, nice line that travels back with symmetry in the loop. That's the envision a lot of people think of when they think of a perfect, effective cast. And it is, when we're talking about distance or, to throw great distances, those 5 essentials become very important. But what we find is, like the majority of the casts we use on the water during the day, I like the term variables to basically say we have to start adding a lot of variables to get what we want with the fishing cast.
If we take that, what you just described as the classic straight line cast, and talk about that as far as Kent's concerned.
Okay.
Because there's a follow-up question there I'm going to ask you about, the most common mistakes casters make. So if we could kind of start there and carry it into the mistakes you see beginners make, and then, based upon that cast alone. I know we've got all kinds of fancy casts to talk about, and each one has its own different power and different
exactly.
stroke.
I think that's a good place to start, talk about the basic, what a lot of people call the foundation stroke, and then kind of not so much add to it, but let's talk about the progression. I mean, because that's the question kind of that we're on, and then talk of, the mistakes that are going to occur.
Okay.
I think a good way to look at all of this is, this goes back to a lot of years of guiding on trout and smallmouth type water, especially for trout stream, though. The journey kind of that casters get on, like when you have a total beginner and they have some flaws in their casting stroke. Basically what happens is they throw out the line in front and it lands in just a big puddle. In other words, it wasn't intended. They're trying to make it go straight, but it lands in a big puddle. And what happens, and the irony of this is, here we're starting out, we get this cast that lands with a bunch of puddle out front, and fish, they actually catch some fish as a total beginner. A little bit of practice, they go to a bunch of lessons. Now they can throw this perfect straight line parallel loop cast. You see the problem that we're getting into is now it goes straight every time. Then we add the dynamics of the water current, and now we deal with drag consistently on the water. So now they become what they think is a much better caster, yet their fish catch ratio drops dramatically. And then later on in the journey, they learn to start controlling that. Instead of being straight, now we can throw hooks and curves and all these other magic into the line, you see. It's almost ironic, isn't it, that when you think about, yet when we start, we did better than when we got halfway. And then we get a little better and we can get over the stage of beginner. But that's what I've always kind of thought, that just from the years of being on the water guiding, that it's kind of a funny progression for that reason. And we can take that. You want to talk about some of the, say, the 5 essentials that we teach for the Federation and why they're there? Is that kind of what you want to do with the effective cast?
Yeah, we need to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about that. But I know, we've got some beginners and we've got some real strong casters on the line. But for the beginners, I want to just kind of touch on that and say, well, when people come to me and they're beginners, hey, this is what I usually see, and here are some of the common things that they have to work on.
Yep.
So let's come back to that after the break, and we'll kind of detail that out. And then we'll get into some of the fancy casts, okay?
Okay, great.
All right. Women's fly fishing in Alaska is owned and operated by well-known female guide Pudge Kleinkopf. Women's Fly Fishing offers several lodge-based fly fishing schools for women, as well as an array of small group guided trips for women and couples to some of Alaska's best-known waters for salmon, rainbow trout, Arctic grayling, and char. Pudge also leads saltwater fly fishing groups to Mexico each spring. Beginners are welcome and equipment is provided. To learn more about fly fishing for women, go to www.womensflyfishing.net. That's womensflyfishing.net. Or you can call Pudge directly at 907-274-7113. That's 907-274-7113. You're listening to Ask About Fly Fishing Internet Radio, and we're talking with Mac Brown about specialty casting, getting your fly to the fish. If you'd like to ask Mac a question, just go to our homepage at askaboutflyfishing.com and use that Q&A text box to send us your question. We'll receive your question immediately, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible on the show tonight. Okay, before you jump into answering that question, I do want to give you a chance to, Mac, tell us just a little bit about, what's happening in your fly fishing world. What are you doing? Are you doing a business? Are you still guiding? What's going on in your world?
Well, I still do quite a bit of casting lessons, and mostly I'm doing quite a bit more of that than actually on the water guiding right now, is I have more of an interest in what we were talking about earlier, the diagnostics part. And I think that's where I find more enjoyment personally at this stage in my life, is to kind of lay a groundwork of where people can build on, like on grass first, and they can work on it on their own, and then apply it to the water. And I'm doing quite a bit more with that. My fly fishing business, I still do quite a bit of destination-type trips, and I enjoy doing a lot of the shows and demos and things like that during the year. But definitely more of an emphasis just on casting at this point.
Okay. And if one wanted to get a hold of you, how would they get a hold of you, Matt?
Probably the best way is through my email address. I think it's on your page, McLeod63@yahoo.com. That's probably the best way to reach
me. You have it on there. Let me just double check. On Mac's page there, we do have his email address on his speaker's page there, as well as his phone number. So folks that aren't on there, Mac's email address is mcleods63@yahoo.com, or go to his speaker's page on our site. You can get his information there. Well, good. And they can also get your book there if they want to inquire about that as well, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, well, let's get back to that question and, just give us a brief rundown on what you see on new casters and things that they need to work on that you find common, and then we'll get into the specialty casting here.
Okay. Well, probably some of the biggest, most common themes with new casters that we'll see, well, I'll go ahead and say what it is like with big shows and things that we see most often with the straight line cast is first the force of how do we apply force to the rod. It takes a little bit of playing around with it, I think, for people to get the feeling of how do we make it go forward. A lot of it, good example is to hear rod noise. Like with a lot of beginners, you'll hear the rod make a whoosh noise through the air, and that's pretty much way more force than is necessary. So I would say that to get the force smoothly accelerated is probably one of the biggest problems at first, and then the next one would be right into rod arc, of not stopping the rod high for the back cast. In other words, if it's not stopped up high, what tends to happen is this big open loop flies backward, which basically initiates quite a bit of slack into the whole system to where it's hard to get it straightened out in front, because we're basically flinging a big open loop like the St. Louis Arch rather than creating a candy cane loop with parallel legs. And those are probably the two biggest. But I think a good way to do it would be because one of the big problems in 30 years of doing this that I've had personally is to incorporate some of the ideals that we're talking about for the variables of all the fishing casts we're going to talk about tonight too. Okay. Because spending hours, this goes back to the mindset, I don't know if you got a chance to look through what I sent to you last week, Roger, but the mindset is so important, and that's what I find is so rarely talked about with the sport of fly casting. And in other words, I think it's the perception. It's like the TV commercial we're talking about at the start of the Olympics the other day. If we go out and spend hundreds and hundreds of hours right at the very beginning of throwing these perfectly straight loops, what I've found in teaching is it becomes very difficult for me to work with that person to take them into all these specialty casts because they've become so trained with this body motion of how to make the line go perfectly straight that basically it takes me 20 times longer with that student than it does with somebody that's starting out new. So I guess the reason I'm saying that is I think it can be more productive a lot of times to start out with maybe not throwing perfectly straight every time for hundreds of hours is what I'm trying to say.
I guess you probably work in some memory into your muscles and brain by doing the same thing over and over again.
Right.
That,
yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And a good example with like a group of people that are starting out, but basically you can use a clothesline or piece of parachute cord, any kind of a string. Like the classes we had at Charlotte a few weeks ago are a good example. These were 5 beginners in the class, 2 of them, probably 55, 60-year-old women, 1 guy that was like 80 years old, and 2 younger guys. We started them off right at the beginning to talk about force. Here's how a line straightens or fails to straighten, or the line kicks. I mean, that premise of saying the line either goes out and fails to straighten is actually a very valuable cast the more that their casting takes off on the stream. And so right away they learn that, hey, we're in control. We either throw it, short before it straightens, it just straightens, or it has so much energy it kicks. And those are the keys to learning how to throw curves right at the beginning. So what I'm trying to say is those beginners in that class in 2 hours' time, if we had those and could put them up against people that have learned to throw straight type casts for years and years, I would bet money my beginners had fishing casts ready for the water.
Wow.
In 2 hours. And that's why I say that the mindset is so critical when talking about a lot of this stuff, because if they follow the wrong road to think perfect practice at what? What did we practice perfect at? Did we practice perfect to throw straight all day long? Then we get to the dilemma of how do we deal with the canopy? How do we deal with these complicated water currents? And you see, that kind of becomes a catch-22 on the water for those folks.
Tell me, Mac, that there is hope for us.
Oh, there's plenty of hope. It's just fun to keep adding a lot of these different variables, and I think that's really what it's all about. And really the best teacher, it's hard to get this in print, and I think talking maybe is a little bit more difficult as well, but the water will make people do, if they get on the water and fish a lot on complicated type streams, I think that they will be pushed to learn this just by dealing with it. And what we're trying to do is just streamline some of that a little bit.
Right. Well, we have a few questions here that I wanted to kind of get through quickly here and they have to do more with equipment.
Right.
And so I'd like to get through those and then start working on specific casts that people have asked here.
Okay.
The first one is Brian Adams in Bakersfield, and he asks about fly rod grip. He said, I see more people using styles other than thumb on top. What do you think is the best, and what are the different styles for?
Right. I think that there's so many different grips depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And like Lee Wolf I'll just mention some of them. And, I mean, there's a lot of them out there, but Lee Wolf preferred, having his index finger on the top of the grip. And I think that actually is a valid grip for short type accurate cast. That's a real good one. I like the key grip quite a bit, the 3-point grip that Jason's talked about in his writings. I think that's a fantastic grip. One that a lot of the folks tend to want to jump into distance. Everybody wants to throw greater distance. And I think that with a lot of the distance cast, it starts, if you're holding the rod with the thumb on the top, basically when we talk about changing up grips, what we're talking about is getting different parts of the wrist involved in the stroke that are more powerful positions. And what you'll find is just rotating the thumb inward for your grip for distance incorporates more flex and wrist extension than strictly abduction or adduction are the terms we use for the thumb on the top. And so basically it becomes a more powerful position for making longer cast. And I think that's why so many different grips, are out there. It depends what we're trying to accomplish. Like my grips for accuracy are far different than my grips for distance, and they change all the time. Like I don't even consciously think about it when I'm doing it. But when we teach it, of course, we talk about it quite a bit.
Okay, so there is no again, we're coming back to variables, right? It depends.
Yeah, it's just a variable. I love that term, it depends. I had a guy at one of the shows a few weeks ago in the audience, and he started using that for all. I said, basically all this depends. Everything has an it depends clause to make it safe, and it really does. That's why they exist. And it would be very limiting to pick a grip and say, we're never going to alter from this grip for everything we ever do. I would find that fairly limiting.
Next question from Dyke in Utah, and he says, I think to be a good caster, you have to have the best casting line. I know that everybody has the best lines, so you go out of your way not worrying about stepping on toes of other companies to tell us the best line. First of all, is line the most important factor, or is it not? And before we go trying to say who's got the best line out there.
Right. Well, I personally feel that it is. I think the line is the most critical part of your equipment. And as far as, for trout fishing, I definitely think that holds true. The line is basically the kind of things we look at. I think he doesn't really mention that, but he kind of does. He says the one that casts through the guides the easiest. Basically, we're talking about the one that has the lowest coefficient of friction. So I did a study at Western Carolina in the mid-'90s where that's what we measured with specific densities, UV, breakdown of different fly lines, and we also studied the coefficient of friction. And I can say this, that yes, the lines vary dramatically with coefficient of friction. I'll probably get those back up on a website. They've been off for about 5 years. But let's see, not to step on any company. That's a tough one. I guess he's asking which one rated the best of that study. We had 56 different lines in that study from all over the world. I'll tell you the one that won was the GPX line from Scientific Angler. And that's a nice way to do it without stepping on any toes, I think.
Yeah. Let the study speak for itself.
I like it kind of like that best. And I have some buddies, too, with UV breakdown. That's the other thing you'll find with a lot of fly lines is some buddies that live down in the Keys, and they string up. They get a lot of lines, from these different line manufacturers, and they leave them strung up year-round sitting in the sun. And then they can see how fast they break down. And they, I think that's probably one of the best ways to find out breakdown of a line. And they've definitely come a long ways the last decade because I find that they're lasting much longer time periods than they did when I was a kid. So the coatings have come light years ahead of where they were when I was a kid.
Okay. Another question here from Henry. He asks about how do you select a matched line backing leader and tippet for distance, and what rod type is best? Titanium, graphite, boron, bamboo, glass. So he's just talking about distance casting. Is there a particular rod material that's better? And then how do you match your lineup if that's important?
Well, there's a lot of different actions and power in different rods. And I think the best thing to do is to get out and cast, at a show somewhere where a lot of them are available to take out and just throw them. And there's not really, it sounds like, it'd be great if there was one that was literally the best, But unfortunately, that's not the case because of the styles of some of us like, different actions in the rod in different places. And what tends to happen is basically if we pick up a rod that's not exactly in the mode of where we like casting it, we adjust to the rod is what I'm trying to say. And I don't know, that sounds kind of weird, I know, but the thing is a good caster can rig up a broomstick and still make good cast, or they could rig up an inferior rod that they really don't like and still make it work is what I'm trying to say. So,
is there any preference, like, when you go to the shows and everybody's doing the tournament casting for distance, is there a preferred setup for something like that and for most casters?
Well, for the line, if you're trying to carry a great deal of line for distance, the line that SA came out with a few years back, that 120-foot line, which is what they use for all the distance competitions. Of course, you'd have to have that 120-foot line to sit there and truly practice distance because it's all about, shooting great distance is really about great carries. And that line, I think, was one of the first lines that's been out that enables a caster to do that. And that fly line is really important for casting distance. As far as those materials that he talks about, graphite would by far be my preference of the ones he talked about. And because of the dampening effect, it recovers the quickest, I think, of the rod materials that he talks about there.
Okay. Well, let's move on and talk about some casts. Chuck in Santa Rosa, California, comes right out with it and says, what's the most difficult specialty cast?
Mm-hmm.
And can one practice specialty casts on grass, or do you need to be on the water?
Yeah, grass is fine.
Hard question.
Everybody has trouble with certain style of cast, like back to the first thing we talked about with force of you'll find that, and I think it's, I don't know if it's personality types or what, but I've found over the years that usually the ones that really gravitate towards these lazy negative style strokes that, you know, we use for curves on the water, which I prefer to fish that way a lot on the water, you'll find that with students, they have one or the other that they prefer. In other words, you know, really wanting to whip the line around at the end and throw all their hooks with a big, you know, positive cast with a lot of energy. And what you tend to find is the ones that pick up on that really quick have a really difficult time to slow things down and learn how to be finesseful and throw the negatives. So it's kind of one or the other always fighting back and forth, and that's kind of the thing. Looking at practice of basically, I'd say a good, you know, way to do it would be to go out and work on the ones that you have more trouble with. And as far as the one that comes to mind right off the bat when you say what is the most difficult one, the one that I've found most difficult that I teach that to other casters, I think it's kind of looking at the cast that has more steps in it. And I would say for me that would be teaching a positive tailing loop cast. And that has so many little nuances during the stroke that I think that's a good way to look at all these casts. The ones that have the most steps are definitely going to be the hardest to learn and reproduce. And that cast has many steps in it. So I would say that's the most difficult one that I teach personally.
Okay, so you said positive tailing loop. Describe for us that cast and what it would be used for.
Okay. What I use that cast for is for years on the stream, you're blocked on the left side, you're blocked totally above with canopy, and you have rhododendron or a lot of trees hanging out over the water, and you want to go back into the prime lie up underneath the branches hanging out over the water. So your opening's on the stream, which is nice. Mother Nature always keeps the stream plenty open from floods. So there's not a lot of low-lying branches, you know, right directly in the middle of the stream for that reason. And what I use that cast for is I want to hook the fly back and up above the rhododendron to get the drift back up and underneath the trees. And so what you can do is your only casting plane that we can use is if you're a right-handed caster, say, your rod would be used on the low right side. And by throwing the tail that's positive, you throw this tail on purpose, and the fly crosses up and over what we call the rod leg of the line and hooks around into the back and above the rhododendron to give you a drift on the way down. And for years I had this example on the stream, and where I didn't know how to solve it, to be honest. It wasn't until I started really playing around with tails about probably 20 years ago when I started using that cast a lot on the water. But just think of the thousands of examples I had to walk up the creek before I had that cast. In other words, I never could deal with it. So that's the practicality, and it's really kind of a bizarre thing to talk about a positive tail in control, you know, but the thing is it opened up another dimension to my fishing on the water when I started playing around with it and using it. And that's why I think it's difficult.
Is that one that you describe in your book?
No.
After?
It came after. That's one of the, I think a lot of this journey, like we talk about, like we're all on the same kind of journey of these tasks that are taught to us by on the water. And these little dimension jumps, I think, just keep happening the older we get. And that we keep adding on to what we knew before, I think. And I wish it was in there before.
Okay. Well, we need to take a quick break, and we'll come back, and we've got more casts that people want to know about. So hang tight with us, and we'll be right back.
Okay.
Pere Marquette River Lodge, a full-service Orvis-endorsed lodge, fly shop, and guide service located on the banks of the historic Pere Marquette River in Baldwin, Michigan. Pere Marquette River Lodge provides year-round lodging for the business or pleasure traveler, as well as a full-service fly shop and guided trips for steelhead, salmon, or large resident brown trout. For more information, visit them at pmlodge.com. That's www.pmlodge.com. Or you can call them at 231-745-3972. That's 231-745-3972. You're listening to Ask About Fly Fishing Internet Radio, and we're talking with Mac Brown about specialty casting, getting your fly to the fish. If you'd like to ask Mac a question, just go to our homepage at askaboutflyfishing.com and use the Q&A text box to send us your message. We'll receive your question immediately, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible on the show tonight. Well, okay, so let's dig into some of these others, Mac. Well, this has to do with practice. Paul in Cobb, California says he's laid up, convalescing, and he wants to practice casting. He's got a bum foot, I think, is what it is here. And his question is a device such as the Flyo or micro practice rod, which is what I own, is what he says, is a practical way to learn form and timing in my situation, or am I just wasting my time?
So I think both of those would be really good. Like if you're laid up inside, I know many guys over in Europe that are having an exceptionally cold winter this year. And these guys that I talk to, they're all instructors, and they play with their MPRs a lot during these cold periods. And I think there's a whole lot of things that they can still learn with that, because the dynamics are still all the same as when you hold your other rod. And things like aerial, doing the mends like in the air versus trying to put these different motions in the casting stroke itself, it becomes really a timing game, and I think that's a great way to get practice with it.
Okay. Another question from Howe in Pennsylvania. Howe asks, and he says this is more about rods than casts, on a small brushy stream, do you recommend a short rod to manage traveling and casting in tight places, or a longer rod for flip casts and drift management?
Right. That's been a common Cracker Barrel discussion for years, hasn't it? I've heard that since I was a kid, and that's a good question. It's gone on for a long time, and I'm sure we'd never get a consensus. Ask 1,000 instructors, you're going to have 1,000 different answers. And I'll tell you what my answer is whether the rod is short or whether it's 10, 11 foot long, that the knowledge of where your loop is and where your line's being cast is really still up to the pilot holding the rod. And so I don't buy into the argument that a 4-foot rod keeps you out of the trees more than a 9-foot rod personally. Because
I'm sure I could get it in the trees.
If we're not sure where the line's going, is my point, it's not going to be a big detriment. So I've never bought into the argument of short rods being a necessity. I have on my rod rack, the shortest rod that I have in there's one of them that's 8.5 feet. Most of them are 9 to 11, if that tells you anything.
Okay, it shows your preference. Yeah. Okay, we've got Mark in Ontario, Canada. And he says, I often fish brushy streams with little space for backcasting. I use a 7.5 3-weight. As a result, I often just dead drift nymphs and do okay. But I want to be able to use dries upstream. I'm tired of littering the trees with my flies. Other than the roll cast, what would you suggest to get my fly into position?
Well, if it's really tight, like really tight brushy streams, there's not anything wrong with tapping the fly, which is how they, talked about it in the 1450s. So that's actually an effective technique, one that I don't see a lot of people really take seriously the further they get on the journey. But tapping's still a highly effective technique. That's one technique you'll see a lot with the local folks around where I live still use on the water. Learn to fish out of ovals and ellipses on the water. That way you can learn to fish with the line always in front of you. And that's a technique I like. I fish that way mostly on small water around here.
Can you describe that in more detail?
Yeah, like back to the guy that had the MPR a minute ago for practice, like take your MPR or your fly line out on the grass even and learn to fish out of basically circles. You can either piece these together with a figure of 8, and that gives you a real comfortable flow like in your casting, or just I like the figure of 8 quite a bit because it occupies less space for quite a bit of line out from the tip. And but circles are good too. All that can help eliminate the mentality that the line has to be to and from, back down, opposite direction of where you plan to cast when you decide to plant the to change the direction of this cast, all you have to do is have a pause. So I think you have a pause, you can have a touchdown, or you can skip the touchdown of the leader on the water. But it just eliminates the caster having to worry about the trees in back and to memorize where that opening is. I mean, I rarely look in back and have to worry about the trees if I keep it all in front the whole day. And,
okay, but I'm still not clear on what you mean by an oval or a circle.
Well, just think of like the direction you're standing with your shoulders square to where you're looking at casting to, okay? And basically if you take your rod in front of you and just work around in a figure of 8, just draw an 8 like on a chalkboard sideways in front and scribe that letter 8 out with your rod tip and learn where you add a little bit of force and learn where you paused until you can make the line flow through that same figure 8 pattern. That's the whole beauty of, like, when you learn to fish out of circles, you can basically eliminate the need to worry about obstacles in back of you because they don't exist. You don't need the line in back of you at all when you start to fish in front.
Okay. And is that limiting as far as distance goes then? It must have some limitation.
Not for the fishing distance, it's not. You know, I mean, yeah, we wouldn't be able to throw great line distances with that, but as far as fishing distances for trout, yeah, I mean, it'll go plenty far enough to do anything you need to do on a trout stream.
Okay. Ralph, and I don't know if this is his last name where he lives in Parker, but he asks about a hopper-dropper combo. Is there a cast that will lessen the chance of tangled flies in a line? I know this is a big problem with a lot of people. Yeah.
I guess timing the biggest thing I've seen with a lot of dropper combos on the water with folks is they're casting it great, you know, and then all of a sudden, bam, the dropper's all knotted up in the hopper, you know. And what tends to happen, the reason it happens is it's just a little timing issue. One mishap and boom, we have some artwork to contend with. And so maybe really keying in on the timing aspect, because that's usually where those things that tend to happen, like I say, of maybe not, you know, waiting long enough for that to straighten and back, and then we rush it a little bit in front, and that's where the knot comes in. And sometimes little larger loops tend to help with it. Another thing that helps with, you know, throwing a little bit larger loop is the Austrian style of casting, which is back to basically the ellipses. What America kind of coined it the Belgian cast years ago, but it's really from Austria. I don't know if, I'm sure y'all have had that on your show before, the Belgian casting back in one plane and changing it for another.
No.
Well,
go ahead, talk about it.
Well, that's a great way to contend with it. And most of it that we see written about in America, Charles Ritz is the one that basically talked about it first in America in the 50s, and it was a river keeper in Austria that basically showed it to Albert Goddard and Charles Ritz. And because those two guys were from Belgium, that's how America coined it the Belgian cast. But, of course, in Europe, if you say that, they're going to say, no, that's the Austrian cast. But that's what it's really about is, say you make a back cast in the horizontal plane and you keep constant tension on the line. We never truly stop, and we swing right back up and make the forward cast in a more vertical plane. I find that the use of those styles of cast tend to work well. That's the way it's described mostly in America, but really the Austrian style of casting just means to switch rod planes. In other words, it's equally as valid to say let's make a back cast in the vertical rod plane and switch to a horizontal rod plane for the forward delivery. And that's the same thing as, you know, it's still the same concept of switching rod planes. Highly effective.
So thereby your flies aren't traveling forward in the same plane that they went back in is what you're avoiding the tangle that way.
Exactly. And it makes it, I think it makes it quite a bit easier to keep those organized throughout the day using kind of a different, basically if I just say switch rod planes, it's the same thing as saying use an Austrian cast.
And you don't have to switch much of a plane, I would think, if you're just off
That's right.
5 degrees or so would maybe help.
That's right.
That?
We can do it just like even in the same almost vertical plane, but this goes back against fighting some or adding variables, I guess you could say, to the straight line cast. Is that's one of the recipes, like when folks get out in the yard and they're playing around with a lot of specialty cast, is the term I call loop planes, to learn to throw the loop plane 360 degrees around the rod tip. So I'll give you an example for that one with the hopper. let's say you're going to make a vertical back cast, have the loop plane off 90 degrees to the side, and then throw it over the top for the forward delivery. And it can be subtle, like to one that seems, that's sitting there watching you do it. You can do it all it appears to be all in the vertical plane, yet we use two different loop planes to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I think that also answers probably David's question from Fort Collins. He's talking about two heavily weighted stone flies and a strike indicator, but we've basically got the same situation going on.
Right.
We've got a lot of stuff in the air, and it can't collide with each other. Otherwise, we got issues.
Right. And I think that's the way to deal. Like it's definitely not graceful and pretty when we start adding lots of weight, and I mean for anybody, but that definitely helps make it quite a bit easier, I think, by switching up the line planes.
Okay. Question from Chris in Boise. What's the recommended cast to use in a river when you're fishing straight up to a riser?
Straight up to a riser.
I think he's talking about, up current.
Right. We got a specific fish we're picking on, not just a general area. So in that example, what comes to mind the quickest to me probably was described well in George Harvey's book years ago called the check cast. And that's one that I use a lot on the water to a specific fish. Like a general area would be a little bit different, but in this example, I think he's saying he has a fish that's already working the top. Right. And what that does, the check cast, basically, you envision the water level of where that fish is rising. Picture the water level up at your eye level, and that's the line plane that you want the loop to unroll. In other words, it's not downward toward the water. You want the fly to turn over at eye level and have enough energy to where the leader snaps back and generates some slack up at the tippet. And then it all drops gracefully down to the water. And that puts the slack up at the fly end. And I think that's a real accurate cast for that type of example. That's what I would probably prefer to go to first.
Okay.
For that one.
We had some questions come in on the Internet while we were talking, and some of them we'll backtrack on a little bit. Art in Council Bluffs, Iowa wants to know, what were those 5 essentials of the cast that you mentioned earlier? Maybe you can say them slower.
Yeah. Well, they're not. These are for a straight line cast. Now, I don't think they're essential. Right. In my philosophy, they're not essential.
But this is the FFF thing, right?
Right. I'm a big believer in variables, which means I'm a foe of rules, okay?
Right.
And, but as far as for a straight line cast, yeah, I could make these work. For talking about straight line casting, these would work fine if we were using it just for that. But so the first one then would say there must be a pause at the end of the stroke. And that pause is going to vary with the duration and with the amount of line beyond the rod tip. So that's the first rule, okay? The second one says there must be a slack line kept to a minimum. That's pretty self-explanatory. The third one is in order to form the most efficient, least air-resistant loop and the direct energy of a fly cast toward a specific target, the caster must move the rod tip in a straight line. And we usually summarize that and just say, look, to get from here to here, point A to B, you need to draw a straight line to be most efficient. The fourth one is the size of the casting arc must vary with the length of line past the rod tip. So the way we apply that a lot is a short cast, you have a short arc. A long cast, we're going to have a longer arc. And it works great for straight line. And power must be applied in the proper amount at the proper place in the stroke. That's back to the apply power smoothly and accelerate smoothly throughout the cast. And those are all great for, like I say, for when we're talking about straight line casting, I think they work great. I'll give you a couple other ones that'll help it for the fishing cast, since most of these questions are all on the fishing cast.
Right.
And I'll just incorporate them right into that. We've already done force at first, talking about, underpowering a cast where the line fails to straighten. We kind of already did that earlier on. We talked about loop planes just a minute ago. And in other words, that candy cane appearance of the loop, learn to throw that loop all around the tip, regardless of rod plane that we're using, whether it's vertical or horizontal. And that's one of the big key ingredients for the fishing cast. And then the third one that I use a lot in teaching these fishing casts is to learn to skew the line planes. In other words, throughout history, hundreds of years of history in this sport, always to and from, talking about, to make a forward cast, the back cast has to be exactly in back, 180 degrees opposite. And what I'm saying is learn to play around with skewing that back cast 30 degrees, 40 degrees, there's no right answer, but skew it from the 180, and you'll get all kinds of different layouts in the forward direction. And I think the hardest one for folks when we're teaching is to play with the timing of late hauls, late shoots, the timing of all that tends to give us, it opens up hundreds of new casts in the dimensions of the fishing casts that we use on the water. That's kind of the ingredients I like to use a lot, are those four.
Okay. Good. Another one came in here about practicing from Ryan in Bakersfield, and he asked, when practicing casting, I've noticed it's easier to hit my target without anything on the end of the line. What is the best for target practice on the end of his line?
Right. I think just a little piece of poly yarn or, polypropylene yarn like we use in fly tying a lot. I'd usually just cut a couple of pieces of fluff and tie it in the tippet at the end to represent, the air resistance of you're going to have some air resistance like with the dry fly when we're talking about hitting targets. I like to have something I can specifically see, like hit that target rather than just a blank leader.
And you just answered his question there, because what he's dealing with is the resistance
of
the fly that he's not dealing with when there's nothing on the end. So
right.
Yeah,
big difference in how it reacts.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I think this one you kind of answered already. J.B. Herrick from Virginia asks about, he's delivering flies primarily upstream on small, sometimes very small streams. I fish a lot for native brook trout, and it can be difficult not to line or otherwise spook these trout as I try to get a nymph or a dry above them that can then float down.
Right.
So would that be the same cast for that fishing upstream to that rising fish that you used before?
It may be. I would say, like in this example, if he would try to hide your cast as much as possible, and a good one, like that's a good question. That's so typical, like in this part of the country.
Okay.
To move slow, to move very slowly as you move up the water. But more importantly than just saying move slowly is to avoid all the TV commercials that we see. In other words, the goal on this small, tight water is to false cast basically as little as possible, that once again is totally opposite. Like you teach beginners in the field and you have them all the time waving this line back and forth, back and forth. Then we start talking about being on the water. Now we're saying, now learn how to do it all in one stroke. All your deliveries in one stroke. And that takes a little bit more time. And so I would say eliminate movement by false casting as little as possible. Use subtle curves with a reach perhaps for laying your line on rocks. And that's how I consider there was some on here about reach casting and those subtle curves on tight water. I look at the reach cast more as to anchor the line, which I'm sure that's what he's dealing with in that part of Virginia. But use the reach more to aim the line onto these rocks to get your float. In other words, to pull your floats off. So it avoids the problematic currents around the line, in other words.
Okay. And that was the next question. Frank in Norwalk, California asks, is it better to use a reach or a hook cast? And why don't you describe the two of them and the differences?
Yeah, the hook cast we use to basically turn the line left or right in front for the layout that we're talking about. The best example that I can think of, like for just a full-on hook cast, would be like a big tailwater out west, and you got a pot of fish working the surface. To throw a hook, it might go out, say, 25 feet and turn 10, 15 feet right or left. And basically what that boils down to is if you had a referee sitting on the riverbank, and as soon as that fly lands on the water, he hits a stopwatch. And that's going to go a very long time. You're going to have maybe 10, 15 seconds of drift with it drag free. And so I think the hook is, if we're talking about that kind of an example, the hook is by far superior to a reach. A reach, on the other hand, is a straight line cast that just reaches the line upstream. But when we look at where the bend occurs to cause drag onto the fly, if you sat and measured both of those casts, you're going to see the hook probably go 4 times further with no drag every time. So if he's asking me which one is better to use on the water, without a doubt the hook.
I'm not sure I understand the difference between the hook and the reach. You gave a very clear picture of the hook.
Yeah, the reach is just reach the rod to the upstream side, like after you've made the cast.
Basically.
It kind of a mend, but the problem is, in my mind with that, is that it's still straight. And like in using it on the water, like in guiding a lot, it's still a straight line cast, and so you get down to the dilemma of, let's say you throw your line straight across the current. Where does the fly drag? Well, what happens is the weakest point in the line is always the middle. So you start to get this big belly formed in the middle of the line, and that's why the fly then drags across the current at 45 degrees. By taking a straight line and putting a little bit of an angle, say 20, 30 degree angle, yet the line's still straight, it's still going to drag the fly instantly, like when it lands because of the line being straight. Does that make sense?
Yep.
That's why the hook is so much, it's superior, because you've got this 90-degree bend that's matching the way the water's already flowing, so you're going to buy yourself so much time for the fish to go ahead and take the fly because it's not dragging across the surface.
So describe to us how you make a hook cast.
Well, which direction are we hooking? There's so many different ways to hook.
Water's coming from the right. It's upstream to the right. We're fishing, and downstream to the left.
Okay, and we're standing on the river left side. We're on the river left bank. Well, there would want a positive hook cast, so all we have to do is form a real narrow, fast loop. A good way to practice this in the yard if people are going to go out and learn to throw these positive hooks would be, this is the easiest one that I find using a lot on the water, is think of a wet towel at the beach and you roll it up and dip the tip of it in a little water. How do you make the towel pop, you know? And a lot of people have, I think everyone's done that at some point, like pop the towel, and it makes that popping noise. It's like breaking the speed of sound barrier basically at the tip of the towel. And we're trying to do that with this line. So what I find works well is if the rod's perpendicular to the direction of the cast and you subtly back the elbow up, just back the whole elbow back, maybe a half an inch to an inch while you through this narrow loop off the horizontal plane on the right side, what you're going to have is this big hook that occurs out front, like 10, 11 feet, kicking downstream to the left with the line going out straight. That would answer your hook cast in that example.
And then I take it off, you're on the other side, then you've got a negative hook.
Exactly.
Right?
In the negative, we're throwing a big open lazy loop. And the whole key for the negative cast, because it's been criticized off and on through literature the last 20, 30 years saying, well, they're not accurate. Well, they're equally as valid as anything we do from the positive side. The difference is the positive has some advantages in that it can go in and around a corner. In other words, if you had a light pole or something out in the yard, you could cast around an object with the positive. So that gives it a little bit of an advantage. But for the example, like just on the water that we're talking about, the negative is done by just throwing a bigger open, lazier loop, and the key to that is the rod fades at the end. That's how we develop our accuracy. You can throw out targets, like throw out balls or something in the yard, and when you're developing your accuracy with the negative, it's all about you can see this great big hook already in the air as it's going out, and when you want to develop accuracy with it, it's when you fade the rod down towards the water that kills the energy in the cast and puts it on the water. That's
great descriptions. Yes, very good. Okay, we've got some other ones here. David in Grand Rapids says, was once shown a cool way of throwing a type of a reach cast. Purpose was to cast to the opposite side of the stream without turning around.
Right.
It was referred to as and demonstrated by Dave Leonard in Traverse City, Michigan. It was called something like a reverse positive reach cast. You know what he's talking about?
No, but it sounds like a reach cast in reverse. That's what I envisioned when you were reading that. You know, I'm trying to follow, like, envision what would I be doing. And if I'm standing backwards to where I'm going to throw the line, I better turn around soon. That's what's going through my mind, just by thinking I better turn around and see what's going on.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if I'm following it. Like, it's rare that I fish in back of me like that. I don't know the answer for that one.
Yeah. Rick in Texas, Mac, my forward loops are clean and tight. My back casts do not match and tend to open up. Any hints?
Well, that's a real good question, because I would say that's the number one thing when people are out practicing in the yard, that most of us tend to get in these periods where our forward cast are far superior to our back cast, and part of that reason is that's the one we usually see. I think that's by far the biggest fault for the majority of all of us. Like when we have to go out and work and clean up stuff, it's usually in the back cast for folks. And I would say just go out and practice making back casts. Instead of trying to put these in the air and go for great distances, just pick out 40, 50 feet of line and work on back cast. In other words, do one, turn around and do it the opposite direction. Just sit there and do back cast after back cast with no forward cast and iron out what's going on. Most likely it's a tracking problem. And there's so many things, you know, without seeing it, it's kind of tough to talk about.
When you say tracking, are you talking about
the rod?
The rod tracking, not straight, but...
Yeah, I'll tell you another good exercise for them that can, this will iron it out real quick. If it is a tracking problem, you know the laser pointers kids play around with, the little lasers that put a little red beam? I don't know what they come, some of them come in like a flashlight size, like a little mini Mave flashlight. But those little beams, what I like to do with tracking issues, you can do it inside a house against a wall, but what really helps is like in a gymnasium, put the red beam on and make your back cast and have it right up at the crease of where the wall meets the ceiling. And what you'll find real quick is when you get in a gymnasium with a 40-foot ceiling, you're basically holding a 40-foot rod with that red laser beam. And if you've got tracking problems at all, it's going to amplify it a great deal when you're shooting it up at the ceiling, you see.
Okay.
That's one of the tricks like to deal with tracking, but it could be even stuff that starts down at stance without saying, you know, the stance. Some people stand square, left foot forward, right foot forward. I'd say this, if it's a right-handed caster and there's tracking issues, you can simplify it a lot of times by coming back, standing square, or putting the right foot forward. And if you notice what that does is it blocks your hips from turning as much into your back cast, which a lot of times will help straighten out the back cast. It could be the stop. It kind of goes into it could be a lot of things. It's almost back to it depends, Roger.
Okay. Brian asked, how do you get your line across multiple currents to the far side of the river and prevent drag? Are we to that hook cast, or are we doing something else?
We might be doing a hook, depending on the current. How do you get across multiple currents? Well,
I guess
classic
slow, a fast, you know, that kind of
thing. A lot of times what happens is on a river, like in that example, talking about going across, I mean, it depends. If the current's all fairly equal and we're talking about just throwing across and how do we get a drift when the water's all fairly consistent over there. But when I read that, right away I think of complications. I think about like a boulder, a great big boulder, and the current's actually flowing the opposite direction. In other words, it's going upstream at a fast rate. That complicates things real quickly. And those are the kind of things, like when I read that statement, right away my mind jumps there and thinks, oh, this is an opposite current. And so I don't know without the description, but it's going to have to be either a pile or a curve, number one, to be thrown across. So if it's the upstream current, we're going to use a curve. It might be a pile if it's a real subtle current difference on the far side, but the best trick for pulling out the long float is more about the line control of what we do after the cast in this example. Like, what are we going to do? As soon as it lands, what are we going to do? And what I see a lot of times people do is they make the cast and they sit back and start waiting for what's going to happen. But to be honest, in those examples, we're constantly adding something back at the rod end side. Now, usually I use what's called a Z method of shaking line out immediately after that example so that I can do a modified, what I call a stack mend. It's like a modified roll cast. And then I can start to dictate what's the line doing in the big current while the fly's trying to get the drift to catch the fish. Okay. And so then we jump right in from that and start doing a series of mends on top of the stack mends. And you can keep it there for a very long time as long as we initiate the line control to make it stay.
And now you just brought us full circle back to that pile cast we were making when we first started.
Yeah, there we go.
Fishing, right? So how do you make a pile cast when you've learned how not to make a pile cast?
Oh, there's so many ways. I like most of my piles to come out of, in like the trout fishing distances. I like to do them probably the most out of the circles we described to you earlier, out of the eights of the circles in front, because that's where I'm usually at. If I am coming from the back, I mean, you can do them there too. You can stall a cast out in the air by basically the same negative cast we described for the curve. The easiest place to start with, I guess, would be to say that is take the negatives that we talked about, turning the hooks to the right-hand side. Just bring that to the vertical, and you can envision what it's going to do in the front. Like do the same exact cast in the vertical plane, and all the leader's going to pile up in a very small area.
Big open loop is what you described before.
Right. Then it's all going to stall out and land all in a very small area. And that's a really effective cast, but you can also do the same thing like with the dry fly by take the same vertical plane and do a positive cast, and now it's going to appear like a tuck cast. And with a dry fly on, it's still going to lead to a pile. And so it gets endless, really. There's so many ways of keep adding little tricks to make these piles. But the best place to start is to do the negative and positives, I think. And once that becomes boring and we can do those in control, then we can start adding all these little nuances of the tricks we do during the stroke.
Okay, we've got Dan in Bismarck, North Dakota, says, I cannot get my roll cast to work, and he cannot make a souffle. Help however you can.
All right. Well, I can't help
so I guess he can't cook or fish. I don't know. Dan's been on our show a lot, but he always leaves an opening for me to make a wisecrack on him. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was a good one. Well, yeah, I don't know about the cake part, but the roll cast, for a static roll cast, there's a lot of different. Roll casts have really come a long ways when you think about the last decade or so with descriptions that are out there. And for years, it was always taught just as a static line roll. In other words, you raise the rod back, you pause, you have a little bit of line and back the tip, and then you make the forward stroke. And the roll cast is really the same exact forward stroke that we make when the line's in the air. It's the same forward cast. It's not any different. But the key is really how much line, for going further and further with your roll cast, how much line can you get extended and back the tip? And so what I think of with roll cast, if we're really going to make a long roll cast, is what we call a dynamic roll cast, which basically throws a big D loop or a small V. A V is even better because it has greater momentum. In other words, just picture a V that's a wedge shape rather than a big D and back the tip. It enables you to have much greater momentum for the back cast, which therefore is going to transfer to having greater tension on the forward cast, which makes it a lot easier to throw far in front. And I got another analogy for you, Roger, with that one. Why the V is so good. I was thinking of this a couple of weeks ago when I was teaching a guy, and this came up, and he kept asking, I don't understand why the V is so much better. And I finally thought, I said, now look, you got a soccer ball sitting still, and you're going to run up and kick it. Now you got the soccer ball moving towards you at 30 miles an hour, and you're going to kick it. Which one goes further? That's why the V is so incredibly powerful for talking about these dynamic roll casts. It's going to add a lot greater momentum overall to the cast.
Now, when you take, I'm trying to, again, picture this in my mind here.
Right.
I understand the D, but how do we accomplish the V?
Well, by sweeping more in a horizontal plane.
Okay.
Just think about just sweeping the rod back in a horizontal plane, and you've thrown a loop of line and back the tip. And if you do it just right, like you don't want to have the leader and everything going all the way and back and straightening out. So what you want it to do is just barely touch down. And you can do that after a little bit of practice, kind of like what they call, there's actually a cast they use in Spey a lot called switch casting, which is very similar to what we're talking about here. And you get practicing it a lot, like on the water. It's best to practice that roll cast, I think, on the water for folks when they're learning it. And get to the point of control where you can judge where the fly lands within a rod length of your body before you change the direction. And once you start doing that, then it makes it fairly easy to throw a much further roll cast than the static roll cast.
Okay. Well, we've about run out of time here already, and we've got a lot. Let me try to squeeze this one more question because it's kind of unusual. Jerry in New York asks, he says, I've been watching Mr. Kondo from Japan talk about underhanded casting. Looks a lot like a roll cast to me. Could you elaborate on why and when I would use this cast? It appears to be a very efficient casting technique. Are you familiar with that one? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's back to the what we were talking about a second ago. A lot of the Spey casting is becoming, it's much more popular kind of in this country the last few years, and it's really exciting because the Spey casting, it's not anything new. That's how they fished in Europe for hundreds of years now, and they're basically change of direction cast. And the underhand casting is a technique that was made famous by Jorn Anderson. And it's exciting in the fact that it's dealing a lot with the switches and the dynamic Vs and the single Spey, double Spey, all those motions in underhand casting. It relies heavily on the upper hand of the rod kind of acting as a pivot point with the power all coming from the bottom hand on the double-handed rod. But basically all the technique is you can do it with your single rod. It's just about going out and playing a lot with the timing of the switch cast and the timing of these dynamic type change of direction strokes. And very good technique. I hope it really gets caught on a lot, quite a bit more in this country in the next few years. I think it'll open up a lot of three-dimensional things for a lot of the straight line talk that's gone on in this country for hundreds of years.
Mac, if you were to you have to do this in fairly short order here,
right.
And it may not be possible, but I'm going to ask you if you're, say an average caster and you're wanting to learn these specialty casts, what steps would you take to learn them? From the straight line cast, what would you start practicing first, second, third, let's say, to try to get to these more complicated casts?
I think that's a good one. Probably the first thing would be to play a lot with varying force, of not trying to, in other words, the goals have to change. We can't go out and practice. Perfect practice is not going out and throwing perfectly straight over and over and over, unless
right.
you're going to be just a tournament caster, which is great. I mean, I think that's a very valid, it's such an important technique for doing that. But the fishing cast, what we find is to get the floats that we're trying to get drag free that generate strikes is really so much more about the variables that throw these curves and piles and all the things we use on the water. So it would be to vary the force, vary the loop plane, vary the line planes, learn to vary the motions away from straight, use convex, concave pass of the rod hand, like during the strokes. It just opens up so many things. And basically there is, to be perfect practice would be to go out and try to jump through new dimensions every time you practice rather than practice the same thing is the best way I know how to describe it in a nutshell. Or get with somebody who does a lot of that, and like out on the West Coast, there's tons of them on the West Coast, on the East Coast, on the Southeast. They're all over the country. It's back to the word-of-mouth thing you were talking about, I think.
Sure. And I suppose a good book like your own would be helpful as well to kind of walk you through a lot of those things.
But it might provide just the stimulus of, like, when you start to get bored with where you are in your practice, it might take you to the next dimension of saying, oh, now if I play with this, then it opens up some other doors. And so I think a lot of times there's a good website, too. Paul Arden runs a website that I find that's where I spend most of my time talking about casting with these other instructors, called sexyloops.com, and that's a fantastic website for those interested with these variables or throwing distance. There's some very good topics on there that I think are pretty good for a stimulus for folks, too.
Okay, good. Well, unfortunately, we got to wrap it up here, but stick with me. And we're going to be giving away a one-year membership to the Federation of Fly Fishers and a one-year subscription to Fly Fusion magazine. And we're going to give away your book, Mac, to some lucky winner out there. So if you folks will stay with me a few minutes longer, we'll do just that. The Bristol Bay region of southwest Alaska is home to the largest runs of wild salmon on the planet and some of the best trophy rainbow trout fishing anywhere. The Pebble Mine still remains a threat to that region, and 2 million acres of federal lands may be at risk. The entire fly fishing industry is united in this epic conservation battle, and anglers across the country are joining the fight. Be one of them. Visit www.savebristolbay.org. That's savebristolbay.org to learn more and about this and how you can get involved. Well, just a quick reminder to everyone, before you leave our website tonight, please take a minute and give us your feedback about the show. You can do so by finding a link on our homepage in the section under tonight's show that says, what did you think of the show? Just click on that link, leave your comments, and we'd really appreciate it. Well, now it's time to give away the prizes, and the first thing we're going to give away is that the membership to Federation of Fly Fishers, which is a great organization, and that's who we were talking about, the certified casting programs that you might be interested in. So great place to get connected with. So we're going to give that one to Walter Dinkins in North Carolina, just around the corner from you. There, Mac. Walter Dinkins.
All right.
You know Walter?
I don't. Where's Walter from?
He just has North Carolina.
Oh.
North Carolina. So at least he's in the same state. So.
Yeah, that's great.
Congratulations, Walter, on winning that one-year membership. And if you already have one, then we'll get it extended for you as well. And if you want to learn more about the Federation of Fly Fishers and also about their certification program, go to fedflyfishers.org. That's fedflyfishers.org. And now we'll give away a one-year subscription to Fly Fusion Magazine, and it's a great magazine out of Calgary, Canada. And that goes to Terrence McManus. And Terrence is in Michigan. So, Terrence, congratulations on that. I'm sure you'll enjoy that subscription as well. And if you want to find out more about Fly Fusion Magazine, go to flyfusionmag.com. flyfusionmag.com. Okay, now, tonight's question. This is going to win you a copy of Mac Brown's Casting Angles, and you'll learn all kinds of, I've been reading his book for the past week here, and there are just all kinds of casting techniques that you'll learn from that. He's really a master at this. So the lucky winner for this is going to answer our question tonight. And I need to clear my queue here. And boy, do we have a lot of other casting questions that came in on the internet. Sorry we couldn't get to them all, folks. But that's the nature of the beast here. All right, here's the question. And you got to submit this along with your location, like your city, state where you're at. Do that in that text box on our homepage. And the question is, what cast did Mac feel was the most difficult specialty cast that he described? It's 3 words. What was that most difficult specialty cast? Well, I think we got one here, Mac, but I'm going to verify through you. Positive tailing loop cast. Is that a winner?
That's a winner.
That's a winner? Well, Caleb Boyle in Gastonia, North Carolina. Another North Carolinian. Well, they're all over the place tonight, I'm telling you. These must be plugs or something. I don't know. You know, what do you call them? Ringers in there or something? But plants?
Yeah.
But Caleb, hey, congratulations. So, Caleb, what you need to do is send me, and you can do it in that same text box, send me your contact information, name, address, email address, and so forth. Phone number would be nice, too, in case we need to contact you. And then we'll get Mac here to send you his book, and I'm sure he'll throw an autograph on that cover as well. So, and thank you, Mac, for providing that book tonight. It's great, and I'm sure Caleb's going to enjoy it.
Well, thanks. I really enjoyed it, and hope everybody has some happy casting for the cold weeks ahead.
Yeah, well, we enjoyed having you tonight. It's been great, and we may have to do this again because we had a lot of, again, lately we've been getting such an incredible response that we've got more questions than we can answer, and but we did get a few of them answered, didn't we?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
well,
I enjoyed
it. Thanks for being here. Good.
Thanks
Our next broadcast will be on March 3rd, and that's going to be at 7 p.m. Mountain, 9 p.m. Eastern. And on that show, we're going to interview Landon Mayer. And our topic for the show will be sight fishing for trout. In fact, Landon's just come out with a new book based upon that as well. And he's perfected the art of sight fishing for trout. His strategies and techniques have worked time after time, landing him and his clients many trophy trout. So listen in and learn about the methods that he uses. We'd like to thank the Federation of Fly Fishers, Fly Fusion Magazine, Royal Gorge Anglers, and Women's Fly Fishing in Alaska for sponsoring our show tonight. And if you think your company might benefit from sponsoring one of our shows, give us a call at 1-800-985-1673. That's 800-985-1673, extension 8. We'll be happy to explain the options available to you. Don't forget to visit our website at askaboutflyfishing.com and make sure you're signed up to receive our announcements so you don't miss out on any of our future broadcasts. Thanks for listening to Ask About Fly Fishing Internet Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show. That's it. Good night, everyone, and good fishing.